Alrighty, we are right at 1:05, so we'll go ahead and get started. I just want to say hello to folks. How y'all feeling today? Feeling good? It's Friday Junior. Yeah, I like Friday Junior. How about y'all?
Friday's better, but yeah, I'll take a second.
Yeah, I don't know. I have appointments stacked all day Friday, so it's not going to feel like Friday till it's over.
Derek, I'm sorry. I've been training the last couple Friday, like the last 5 Fridays, and I'm like, these Fridays feel different. All right. Well, just a quick question so I can kind of be grounded in who's in the room. How many folks were in my trauma-informed care, the power of inquisition training I did a while back? No one.
Was that the
Oh,
motivational interviewing one?
no, we did do a motivational interviewing one too, but I did trauma-informed care around inquisition. It was a while ago. So I incorporated some of it into this one because I wasn't sure. So it's good. It won't be a repeat for anyone, but we'll take some time and go through that. All right, awesome. Well, let's just kick it off by getting us chatting and getting to know one another a little bit more. I don't want to spend too much of our time introducing ourselves. So I'm hoping that just the structure of our day-to-day will give us plenty of time to get to know one another, to learn from each other in the room. But maybe we can just start off with what's a favorite thing? What's one thing that's a favorite thing of yours about this time of year? Is there anything that you particularly like about this time of year?
I love Christmas lights.
Nice.
Spending time with my family.
Beautiful.
I love Thanksgiving.
I love food.
Me too.
And
Me too.
I had to make that distinction because I'm a person who is not very good cooking. So I always like to say, oh, I like this time of year, but then folks are like, what do you make? And I'm like, this is an important distinction here. I don't make anything.
When I have time, I actually enjoy raking up the leaves because I have a big yard and an urban garden. And so it's part of my compost for the next year. But I've been so busy, I have not had time to do it. So I just look at them sadly every day, waiting for the chance.
I like the
That
candles
is-
in my windows. I put candles up and they'll stay up until I open the windows again. So like usually till like February or March.
I love it. I love it. I see food in the chat. Yes. The holidays. I'm really big. I know the holidays are experienced very differently for a lot of different people. And so just honoring that and creating space for that, holding that as truth. I know many of us know that to be truth, whether in our own lives or with people who are close to us. I am a big fan of the decor season. I think something about it just still feels really magical for me. So if it were appropriate, I'd show you all the decor, but it's not. So Sherry, we're similar in that way. Gotta make time for the we gotta make time for the eating, but not the cooking. If it weren't for people who love to enjoy the things that people cook, the people who cook would have, really boring holidays as well. No one.
I like to cook, so I can understand that. I like to cook for other people, especially.
I love that. That's so thoughtful. Alrighty. Well, let's get into our content for today. We're going to get into our content for today. We have a lot to cover in not that long of a time. I love it. Thank you all for sharing in the chat as well. Today, we're going to be talking about trauma-informed supervision. And in talking about trauma-informed supervision, we're also going to talk about trauma-informed care in general. What that means, what that looks like, what's signified by trauma informed. And yeah, so let's jump right into it. A little bit about me. I came in telling you all of my business about not being able to cook and loving to eat and being outrageous with holiday decor, but I probably should tell you why I'm facilitating a training on trauma-informed supervision. If I were you, I would want to know a little bit about that. Yes, that is a great question. Will the presentation be available after? I can make sure that it is available to you after. Yep. Especially if you've gotten the other ones. I'm also hoping they make the recording available to you too, which would be even better. Yeah. Oh, Pete, I love that. I love that. Nothing like a good soundscape. But yes, if I were listening, I'd want to know who's speaking and why. So my name is Ashley. I am the Director for Strategic Transformation at C4 Innovations, and my center really focuses on organizational change practices. So all types of social change. This is Eartha. I apologize. She's saying hello. All sorts of change practices are embedded within that. I have a special focus on equity and helping to define that and helping people understand the long history and context for equity, about the process of doing critical examination of how do we ensure all people have access in varying different capacities. So my work really centers around that, and the center focuses on making change, which is hard, possible. I'm also a professor. I'm a professor of social work in the College of Public Health. I've been a professor for about probably over a decade now, teaching at many different universities, teaching courses on social justice, teaching direct service professionals, as well as policy-based trajectory professionals. I am a mental health service provider, so I have some background in providing immediate and direct service. Most of my focus in that work is on trauma-related or trauma-specific mental health services. Researcher in providing consulting services that, I'm really excited, have been able to have some pretty significant impact. I had the privilege and opportunity to work on several different documentaries, one of which did get an Emmy Award, which I think shows I emphasize that because I think what it showed me was that people really want to hear from people's lived experience, because that's what it really focused on. So for me, that amplifies the importance of lived experience. And most importantly, across the multitude of different things that I talk about in my work, I am considered in a lot of spaces a subject matter expert, but what that really means to me is that I'm also a person with lived experience with a lot of intersecting topics that I present on, and being a person who's lived it, whether directly, vicariously, or with a lot of inside perspective from people who I'm in community with, I think that that's what's at the forefront of this for me. So it's nice to meet you all. I'm really glad to be here. I'm glad to be able to share with you all. And I'm going to kick us off with some trauma-informed, equity-centered best practices. These are conversational best practices as we get into some topics that'll be important, that will require some level of sharing and active participation from you all. These are some things that'll be helpful for us, but these are also things that are absolutely used not only in supervision, but in providing a culture, a community within the work environment that's healthy and facilitative of healthy communication. I don't know about you all, but I've been listening in a lot of spaces and hearing people share. And one of the things that keeps coming up is that people are really afraid of conflict, and how people are defining conflict is having difficult conversations. People are afraid to have difficult conversations. And when we aren't able to have healthy or productive conversations, or as some people would define it as conflict, we miss the opportunity to address potential consequences of not having those conversations. So I think about starting with conversational practices is the most important, and then we'll get into some of the content. As I go through these, I'm going to ask us in the room any that stand out to you, any that you particularly like, and I'll provide a moment for us to share after I finish giving a brief overview of them. The first is to expect a lack of closure. It's a journey. A lot of times we go into things and the desire is to have a nice bow tied on the end of it, but the gift is really in the present, being able to acknowledge that things will be a journey and not necessarily always have a distinct mark closure on it. ask for clarification. With 23 of us in here and many of us having very diverse staffs, there's always going to be different ways that we talk about or engage with different topics. And so asking for clarification could be a very simple way to ensure that the conversation continues instead of shuts down, saying, you know, when I use this language, this is typically how this resonates with me. I'm wondering how that term shows up for you, opening the door for the conversation to continue. Embracing discomfort. Discomfort shows up in our bodies in a lot of different ways. Some of us, it's like a growing excitement. For others of us, it is like a physical feeling in our body that we don't want to be in. And so acknowledging that discomfort can even show up differently in our bodies. But a lot of times when that discomfort shows up, it's a critical cue for us to lean in, or that there's something that we need to address in a space, or that there's an opportunity for a strategy. And so when growth happens, discomfort comes with that. And so embracing it as a natural, healthy part of team dynamics can be really useful. This is not work for others, it's for us. I like to focus the trauma-informed supervision component on not only talking about how we can be trauma-informed supervisors, but what trauma-informed supervision does for us. It is absolutely something that creates a safer environment for folks who are leading teams. And that is one of the most important outcomes of this, is how do you show up and how are you able to be well navigating so many other knowns and unknowns, as we'll talk about later. Honoring all expertise and experiences, recognizing that they come in different forms. This is absolutely true here. As we talk, I'll ask you for your opinion and perspectives. And I know that there's a lot of lived and living in expertise in this room. And so I just want to honor that as we have this conversation, lived and living expertise will always be paramount as a paramount form of knowledge. So I want to invite that intentionally into the space. I want to create a space that allows for both safety and bravery. There's going to be times where we need either or both. And things that feel really safe for one person to bring up might require a little bit of bravery for someone else, and vice versa. And that will be constantly shifting and changing. My personal favorite is revisiting welcome. This recognizes that we all have a multitude of diverse processing styles. So what that means is that as we're talking, some of us, our ideas will formulate, we'll chime in, we'll share. And then for others of us, it won't be until we're 5 slides later, 30 slides later, tomorrow, while you're brushing your teeth, or at some point next week, you're going to be like, you know what? That's the point that I wanted. Oh, I should have asked that. And I just want to acknowledge within this space that at any point in time, or 3 a.m., it's always 3 a.m., Jennifer. It always is, that you'll have that realization. And when we have that experience, we typically feel like we missed the opportunity. Oh, I can't bring that back up now. If we establish a culture where revisiting is welcome, we will see drastic transformational change in conversations. People process information differently. So if you're asking me or you're asking someone for an immediate response, but they haven't had a chance to let that marinate or really formulate all of the data that's going to be the most comprehensive response, then we're going to get not full responses. But if you allow a space where we can revisit and people can come back to things, we'll actually be able to have much more formulated conversations, because it opens that window of opportunity for diverse processing styles to be welcome. We want to affirm and give credit to each other, hype each other up, celebrate one another, revoke expert positioning. You all are supervisors, so you're asked to have answers all the time. So welcoming you into a space where you don't have to have any answers, and allowing ourselves to not feel that pressure of having to know everything all the time. Listening to understand, even if we don't agree. The probability that people agree on things, especially right now, is highly unlikely. So we're not necessarily looking to agree on everything. We're looking to create an environment where people can be fully heard, which means that we have to create a space where we're listening for the fullness of someone's response, not listening to respond. And that's a really unique skill set. When we listen to understand, we resist that automatic and natural cognitive response that emerges for us to say, oh yeah, I have an answer for you right away. It's like that feeling I'm going to forget something, but instead it's recognizing, we might say, let me think about that for a second, because we're listening to the fullness of what someone says. I like to describe it this way. If anyone's ever had a conversation where you're like, as soon as they finish, I have to remind them that that was not October. That was actually last November. And by the time they finish, you have no idea what they said. Never has happened to me, of course. Just a totally random example with specificity. We want to be accountable for the impact of our words and actions. We can intend for something to land one way and it land totally different. And we want to be able to be accountable for that. What that requires, though, is clarity. What it requires is for us to be gentle with ourselves and others and to give ourselves grace. So I'm going to combine a couple of those there at this moment, because in order to be accountable, we have to be able to give ourselves grace. We have to be able to recognize that we're humans and that inevitably we might see an opportunity to do something different. Excuse me. My second favorite is accountability is kind, which is a reframe of people being apprehensive to have difficult conversations right now. Because, well, maybe some of us haven't had the best experiences. But when we allow ourselves to lean into a reframe of accountability as a kind act, it repositions our expectations around it. So if I say or I do something that could potentially cause or evoke harm, if someone brings that to my awareness, it's a very kind thing to do. It's kind because it gives me the opportunity to do something else. It's kind because it requires a little bravery to tell me that. And it's also kind to the people who I potentially won't create an unwelcoming or hurtful environment for in the future. So this could look like, hey, Ashley, I know you really care about this topic. I just want to let you know when you said this, it landed that way. And I don't know that that's what you were hoping as an outcome. So I wanted to bring that to your awareness. That's a very kind thing to do. And then last but certainly not least, we cannot challenge what we cannot acknowledge. I like to honor like James Baldwin and the likes in this one, because not everything faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. So we have to be able to acknowledge things in order to challenge them and to create opportunities for growth to occur. So this list, I just want to hear from a few folks. Actually, I'd love to hear from everyone, but welcoming space for a few folks. Any that stand out to you, any that you particularly like, or if you have a question about one, that's welcome too. Yeah, Lori.
I'll be the first to go.
Awesome.
I know for me, something that I tend to do, I always feel like when someone needs something, in those moments when there's like 10 people that need something from you, I have to have an answer.
Yeah.
And I get anxiety when I don't have an answer. So it's like revoke that expert positioning, because I often feel like I'm supposed to have the answer for everything, but I don't necessarily have that answer.
Yeah.
And it brings up a lot of anxiety when I don't, or when I can't meet everybody's needs that all needs me at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Laura, you know, if there was like something I could take to know everything and be able to, I would do it. I really would. Like, I would love to be able to know everything. And it's just not possible, right? So that part about giving ourselves grace too. And I think it's beautiful when we're able to even model for folks like, these are really great questions. And I will absolutely work together so we can figure out the answers. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that resonates with so many folks. I know it resonates with me. Derek and Rebecca.
Yeah, so the one I have the hardest time with is embrace discomfort. In my own life, I tend to avoid discomfort, but in a supervisory position, I can't just give up because I've got to balance
Yeah.
the directions from above with the people below. The one that resonates the most with me is the last one that you highlighted, where we can't challenge what we can't acknowledge. And I just feel like where we're at, both nationally and at the state level right now, I think there are a lot of things that we need to acknowledge so that we can start trying to address them that I think a lot of our leaders are trying not to acknowledge. So that one seems especially important to me right now.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, Derek. It's been really hard to talk about things. And really hard. Yeah. Rebecca.
So I agree with Derek on embrace discomfort. I'm awful at it as well. And I'm really trying to work on it myself and get better at it. But what I really liked out of this list was listen to understand, even if we don't agree. I like, I love it. I think I'm trying to do that daily, with clients, with staff, and I do like, it resonated with me. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Yeah. Any others? T. Pizzarella, I don't know your first name. I apologize. I saw you on mute. Did you want to share?
Yeah, I think the one that stood out for me was accountability is kind. I was recently having a conversation with a colleague about nice versus kind and how like
Mm,
the nice thing to do is often to like placate and kind of just give people what they want to hear. And I think that like growth doesn't happen without feedback and without honesty. So I think that accountability as kindness is definitely something that stuck out.
yeah. Thank you. Yeah, those are two of my favorites for sure. Ashley, also a great name. I don't know why I have this bias about.
So I'm gonna piggyback off of T. I really liked clear is kind, because as a supervisor and just like an empathetic person and a social worker, like I tend to want to sugarcoat things. But I've had the privilege of working with a supervisor who's on this call, Jennifer, who is very clear and direct. And I've seen how much that's like benefited me. So that's allowed me to be more comfortable doing that with other people. I like what you said. You said, what did you say? Nice is, what did you say? Kind is not nice or nice, but you're muted. Sorry.
I think T might have had to take a call, but
Okay. Well, I liked what he said, what they said. Thank you.
yeah, absolutely. T, it's okay, T. We're just asked for you to re-drop that quote you said about nice and kind.
I was just saying that I was having a conversation with someone about being nice versus being kind and how nice is kind of like placating and telling people what they want to hear, and being kind is kind of that accountability of like, I care about you and I want you to succeed, and growth can't happen without that feedback.
That's so good. That's so good. And thank you for beautifully navigating us talking to you while on the phone. That was just expert multi-handling. Marcy, I saw that you had something to share too, and then we could continue with the content, but certainly welcoming people to share as well.
I just always like the revisiting welcome is
Mhm.
because I think in this world where things are like kind of like rushed and we're kind of like going on, I like the idea of being able to go back. And sometimes like if you might not want to be that one or feeling like you're like stalling the progression or even of the conversation. So I really like that revisiting is welcomed because not everybody gets everything at the same time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A way that has improved things not only in my experience as a supervisor, but just in my life. I'm gonna get what I need to get out right now, and I welcome your perspective after you've had the time to process it, because you just know what you're gonna get is so much more dynamic and filled with accurate reflection, as opposed to forcing all of us to come up with something right immediately in the moment. That's just not a natural cognitive style for most of us. And so I think that has just been, that one I say is one of my favorites because it's just been transformational for me. So just to ground us in trauma-informed supervision, some of you may treat, diagnose trauma in some capacity of your work. And one of the things that I think is most complex about trauma informed is really talking about a process of critical inquisition, recognizing that we don't know if something is trauma or is not trauma. So the goal and objective is not to be like, I am now identifying that as a trauma response. No, the goal is to say, I don't know. And because I don't know, this is this approach that I'm going to take to assure everyone is able to have a safe, impactful, but also growth-oriented, healing-centered, and productivity conducive environment to be able to navigate. So I like to name that. And one of the things that helps me start to think about what trauma-informed engagement looks like is to introduce you all to my friend here. let's say that my lovely friend, which many of my students have named Leo for whatever reason, no, is in the room with you right now, surprisingly. You had no idea, but you turn around and there's Leo. What are you going to do? Bertha, my cat, who you see is about the closest to Leo right now, as she is being very distracted. Go to faint. Mm-hmm.
Panic.
Panic. Scream. Freak out. Freeze. Run. Scream. When I do this in person, people sometimes say, just gotta be faster than you. I'm like, fair. Also kind of rough, but thank you. Not a hard task there. What else might folks do? Leo is in the room with you. Look for food. Freeze. Yeah. Back up slowly. Pet Leo. Exactly. Good kitty. I just want to pet you. Exactly. And I'd like to make use of Leo because this is something that I think we could easily shake off, such as the people try to engage us in this exercise of thinking of trauma responses. It's usually something that folks are likely to experience. But I will admit that one time in doing this exercise, someone who had grown up around actual lions and like had a parent who was a lion tamer was in the room. They gave me very specific instructions for what to do. I don't remember any of them because I was really excited to have met them. So can't help us with this actual scenario. But the point is that a lot of times there are lions in the room. The lion's not a physical lion, but a lion's a difficult conversation, fear that you're not going to be able to access services, fear that, this meeting that you're about to have is going to be the one that ends it all, fear of experiencing something that is activating. You'll hear me use the word activate a lot. I use that synonymously with how people use the term trigger. I just want to name that while it came to mind. The reason why is I do a lot of gun violence work and the term triggering can be triggering. So I use the term activating, but I am using it synonymously with trigger. So things could be activating, right? And some of what we describe when we think about Leo are fight responses, flight responses, freeze, fawn, and faint. And a lot of times we'll talk about those fight and flight and freeze because those are the ones that we're typically familiar with when we think about how the brain works. And when we go into that automatic survival mode or the reptilian brain becomes activated, these are our body's very natural, thank goodness that we have them, automatic responses where we don't necessarily have choice. Right? I asked you what you would do and you're able to quickly think about it. But ultimately, if that scenario was real, you would do something and it would be quite involuntary. And so we see a lot of different descriptions, both positive and negative labels, both positive and negative associated with each of these, with fighting responses, with flight responses, with freeze responses. Fawn is one that people typically have not heard of as often. That one's about appeasing a threat or being positively received to mitigate that threat. So this is one that may be labeled as like extremely helpful or maybe a people pleaser or very passive or agreeable in order to mitigate the threat. And then faint is one that is not likely to be seen in a supervisory context because this is the least voluntary of them all. This is when someone would physically faint. And so that's usually not a response to a reactivation of a trigger of a trauma, but it is something that does happen. So I like to leave it in and I like to acknowledge that. But these are some of the ways that trauma can show up. And when they show up, like I mentioned, there tends to be labels. This person is really procrastinating. This person's being really difficult. This person's really avoiding. And we don't know if as supervisors, we don't know if that's showing up as a trauma response or whether that's showing up because of work ethic. And so we'll talk about how to navigate that complexity, but also honor that that's a real thing that people navigate through. So let's start with talking about what is trauma, and then we'll talk about what supervision, and we'll talk about the critical intersections. Trauma is adversity. Chronic stress is universal to the human experience. Groups can experience trauma, organizations can experience trauma, an individual can. There's a lot of important context between trauma being the event, where something happens and that event is the trauma that happened and it's experienced by an individual. But a lot of contemporary scholarship on trauma also acknowledges that trauma is not necessarily the event, but how that event is processed through the body, which helps us understand the context that two people, you and I, could both go through the same event, and it is immediately processed in my body and experienced as trauma, but maybe not in yours. And so we want to look at what that experience is. If we're looking at like the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for a diagnosis of like post-traumatic stress disorder or something like that, we're looking at it overwhelming a person's ability to cope. We know that there's a lot of different variables that would influence whether or not something is experienced as trauma. And so all of that is important context to make sense. Individual trauma can result from an event, series of events, circumstances. It has lasting effects on people's functioning. This could be physical, social, emotional, spiritual. Trauma is subjective. It overwhelms a person, but may not overwhelm another. I was doing a trauma-informed supervision training with one of my colleagues yesterday, and I love that she brought up big T, little t trauma. And some of us might have heard people say, well, this is big T trauma, or that's little t trauma. And we want to acknowledge that what people are trying to describe is the difference between like diagnosable, meaning criteria, versus some things that could be more frequently experienced. But that is actually a pretty harmful way to think about trauma, as like big trauma or little trauma, big T trauma, little t trauma, because what is experienced as by a person as trauma is what makes it significant. So whether it's something that we're able to label as big or small really minimizes the impact that it has on a particular individual given their circumstances. So we don't get to decide if it's a significant or not significant trauma for someone else. Trauma is trauma. In housing and supportive services, both clients and staff experience trauma. And so we want to think about the event, whether the event is the thing that is producing the trauma, whether it's the person's experience with the event, or whether it's the effects of that event. All of those distinctions can contribute as to whether or not something is experienced in someone's life as trauma, which is another reason why we don't get to say, that's trauma. That's why we get to ask the question and say, I don't actually know, but I'm going to use this approach in the event that it is, because that creates a safer environment for the greater good. People have a lot of different relationships with the term supervision, but supervision as it's defined is usually viewed as a partnership. It is not something that's done to a person, but it's something that is done in collaboration with folks. It requires active participation from both the person being supervised and the supervisee, if that's the language folks choose to use. And I recognize that we might have a lot of different ways that we define supervision in our own roles. But it can also be a part of training, providing ongoing support, but also some of the very dynamic administrative components of your work. So I'm just going to pause here for a moment and ask, what are some of the traits that you think are most important in trauma-informed supervision? What are some of the traits that you find to be most important in trauma-informed supervision? Listening, active listening, what else? Equity. Creating an open space that assumes positive regard when mistakes happen, right? Creating some normalcy around this concept that things will happen. Trying to understand where the person's coming from, being open to hearing something you may or may not agree with, while also being able to stay grounded, giving people grace. Yeah, absolutely. Consistency. Ugh. Consistency. Non-judgmental. I emphasize consistency like that because one of the things I think about that's really imperative in creating a trauma-informed environment is consistency. That's how people begin to heal from trauma. And I don't think any of us would be surprised to say that people have had some really difficult work environment experiences that have shown up in their lives as trauma, reflection, and listening. Absolutely. So let's look at some of the intersections and why both matter. Supervision expertise alone risks the re-traumatization through rigid approaches. Trauma expertise alone risks losing accountability and structure. Structure and accountability can feel really safe and is really safe and helps that predictability, that consistency. See, we'll be sure to share it. The intersection is effective, sustainable, and equitable supervision. So much of what you all shared. And we know that this is especially important in the work that you do because there's a high level of accountability. There's the necessity for safety, for compliance, for outcome. I know the word compliance can be a little activating for us right now too, just acknowledging that. But it's also a place where there's a high need for support, where people are experiencing a lot of secondary trauma, burnout, and compassion fatigue. While we still have a lot to cover, I think it's really important that I pause here for a moment and talk a little bit about the importance of secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, and compassion fatigue, and some of the things that I'm seeing that are very contemporary and things that you're likely going to see an increase of as a result of the many different changes or shifts people are experiencing. So the secondary trauma and vicarious trauma are typically described as the same. In the work that you all are doing, the probability that someone, including yourself, is going to experience secondary trauma is very high. That's from hearing the stories of other people, understanding the circumstances, leaning in and being connected to the work that you're doing, and feeling the emotional labor that is required in order to show up fully in this work, which means that you might experience heightened levels of stress. All stress is not, quote, quote, if you're not looking at your screen, I'm doing quote fingers, bad stress. Some stress is eustress, which is a term that describes things that are happening that aren't bad things, but are also stress inducive, like having a lot of people and being able to serve a lot of people. And you're excited and happy that you're able to do that, but it can also be stressful. Vicarious trauma and vicarious stress shows up when there's some level of immediate connection that you feel to the folks. So maybe you have folks who you're supervising who have lived experience and are also serving a population that they have an immediate connection to. Maybe that's true for yourself. You may be experiencing vicarious trauma, which means that it's shifting or changing your worldview and your cognitive schema, understanding of things, in addition to being stressful. Those things are important to look out for. And more importantly, to acknowledge. And then compassion fatigue, I think we're going to see an increase in compassion fatigue, and knowing about it helps us to reduce it all in of itself, because compassion fatigue shows up when we're not able to have the impact that we're used to or show up to this work to have. So with differential resources, with higher demand, we're going to see a lot more need for services in coming years. There's going to be potentially times where those resources are where we have the resources, and there's going to be times when we don't have as many resources. And a lot of people don't really define compassion. Compassion is that empathy you feel plus action, which is why when we demonstrate a compassionate response to someone, we end up experiencing it positively in our bodies. So when we look at the neuroscience of compassion and empathy, it actually produces an internal response for us, chemical, hormonal response that brings up positive feelings and positive experiences associated with the work that we're able to do. AKA, when you're able to help people, it feels good. And it's a motivator to continue to do the work. But as resources continue to fluctuate, we might not be able to help people to the same extent that we were. You might have longer lines, you might have longer waits, you might have to tell more people, no, not right now, or we're working on it. And in doing that, you're going to see an increase of compassion fatigue because you're not getting that positive feedback internally for being able to help someone in the way that we're associating positive help with. And so what that looks like in terms of for ourselves and for people who we're supervising, reminding us that whatever we set as that outcome as success for helping people also has to expand. Listening to people, being there to support people, being someone who trusts and believes people is in itself an important outcome to providing support. And when we're able to do that, we are also helping people, even if we don't have the resources to get to that overall goal that we might have. Am I clear there? Sometimes I like to just check in and make sure that I'm being clear. Okay. So in this work, we want to take an ecological approach. We want to think about people with an environment. And the definition of an ecology is a branch of science that's concerned with the interrelationships of organisms and their environment. We're talking about the totality of patterns between organisms and their environment, and acknowledging that these are typically intricate, delicate, and complex. And so we are intricate, delicate, and complex. And so that's the approach that we want to take by examining the experiences of people and environment. When we're supervising folks, we're looking at this in an interpersonal way, organizational way, as well as systemic. So this content is some of the content that I covered in the first course. I would like to spend our last 30 minutes or so or 40 minutes focusing on supervision specific solutions. However, I do want to go through this content since most folks were not there to talk about what is psychological safety, because as supervisors, this is something that is going to be quite important. First, in talking about psychological safety, the definition of psychological safety has shifted a lot from 1980 to current times. So when we look at the first definitions of psychological safety, it's about being able to successfully navigate through change. And whether or not a person feels like they're able to successfully navigate change is what determines whether or not they feel psychologically safe. The 1990 definition of psychological safety talks about people's ability to feel successfully able to navigate through conflict at work or feeling like they're able to bring their true selves to work. 1990 is when the term is often coined, and by Edmondson, and what that refers to is within groups within the work environment. Do people feel that they're able to provide different ideas or share different ideas, have a different perspective, and be received with safety at work? Where we get to a 2023 definition, where it really looks at whether or not people feel safe to object, to share different perspectives, to create, to innovate, to engage with differing contexts. All of that creates this web of the feeling of psychological safety. So I like to include these two quotes about psychological safety. The first is, if an environment feels threatening, we will tend to conform. We'll do this to achieve a sense of safety and protection. Leaders who take this on will benefit from greater innovation, better organizational learning, and employees who feel confident and engaged because they're able to bring their true selves to work. Now, if this was an equity-centered trauma-informed supervision, we'd talk about how important identity and being able to show up with our identities often in the work environment is, right? And in general, people tend to contort in order to feel like they can feel safe. This compromises our ability to do excellent work. So the second quote that is about inclusion and authenticity says that when our bodies and minds experience the psychological safety, our social engagement centers enable, which allows us to collaborate, to listen, to empathize, to connect, to be creative and innovative and bold. And this has positive benefits for our relationships as well as our lives in general. To talk about how to create organizational culture change as supervisors, I like to use bias as an example. And before talking about bias, Because typically we don't talk about bias in the context of trauma-informed supervision. So I want to give some context. I want to talk about why. One, biases are a normal part of human cognition. Everyone has biases. And the other thing that's important to name as a foundation is that biases can be positive, they can be negative, and they can be neutral. I have positive biases that folks who came to this particular training are just phenomenal supervisors already. Like, yes, we're here to learn a bit more, but I have a positive bias that these are some of the best supervisors ever to exist. And people typically won't challenge me on that positive bias because, well, I'm right. But we mostly experience conflict around bias when they're negative, but they could be positive and they could be neutral, which means that allows us to understand how biases end up shaping culture. As a supervisor who's looking to create a change, especially one that's around creating a more trauma-informed environment, understanding this, I think, is one of the most important things to actually making change happen. I love training, but I also recognize that information is good information and a good training is a good training. And the ultimate goal should be that when we're able to leave, we're able to put it into action, not just helpful information, but like, well, what's next? And this part about bias, while it's not traditional in a trauma-informed supervision course, I think makes it really tangible as to how we can positively influence a culture within the work environment to create a space that is more trauma-informed and specifically healing-centered. Right? It allows us to respond versus to avoid. And it also allows us to be aware of how to address inequities. In addition to what we might be considering as like individual biases that are showing up, this is also about addressing institutional biases, the practices or the norms that favor one way of doing it, one approach over another. We've been doing this like this for years. This is just the way that it is. Oh, folks from this community are always like this. We just have to be prepared to, address it differently. These institutionalized biases that can show up. And so I teach this by saying, well, we have a really big problem with how we address bias. Bias trainings typically are really ineffective. And if anyone's taken the Harvard IAT, you probably have had an experience where you did not like it. And the reason why is that it is also part of the solution. The problem with biases is that we tend to try to address things on individual levels, which isn't to suggest that addressing things on an individual level isn't important, but that's not where we get the greatest impact. Typically, we'll try to say, well, the IAT says that this is how you feel, or, I need to address this bias with Ashley, which will be helpful in the short term. But what the IAT actually assesses, and if you're not familiar, I'll send you some resource on that. But what bias trainings are really should be getting at is how to impact that broader culture. It becomes a web. So I have a bias and I project this bias, and then you agree, and then someone else participates, and then someone else laughs, and then someone else doesn't say anything at all. And at some point, someone's now heard that from 5 different people, and they go, no, that's definitely a fact. We've had lots of clients who come from that community, and it's always the same thing. Or no, that's just the way that this person is, or all of these institutional biases, or, people who come here are just going to exploit you. You got to develop thick skin to work here. Trauma is inevitable, people burn out here. Those things end up having this bigger impact that influences the culture. So if we really want to address biases, instead of only focusing on addressing biases with individuals, we want to learn how to support people in addressing biases with the larger web, empowering people to develop the skills to be able to address and confront things, to interject, to successfully and healthfully oppose, to present new ideas, to ask questions. Because when people are able to successfully do that, it creates an opening within culture for it to be more healing centered. As I mentioned, biases aren't always negative. They can go the other direction as well. And please forgive the formatting issue on the slide. But if we can empower, not saying that people are not empowered, but lean in on the strengths that people already have to say that it's okay to challenge. It's okay to disagree. Here are the skills for how to do this. It's okay to ask questions. Then we'll ultimately begin to see a culture shift that occurs that reduces bias. For folks who are familiar with the Harvard IAT, what makes it so accurate is that it can predict within the areas that you live and exist and work in, etc., how likely you are to have a bias based on everyone else's bias around you, not necessarily your own. And so what this really important data teaches us is that as supervisors, when we focus on the web, on the side conversations, on the culture, that is where we'll see long-lasting impact that can be healing centered. So are we thinking about those team dynamics? Are we thinking about building people's skills, which starts with their conversations with us to say, it's okay to inquire. It's okay to not know everything. It's okay to say, that's a really good question. I'm going to come back to that, going back to what we were talking about earlier. We have to see the work that we're doing as culture changes. Now, when it comes to trauma-informed, well, let me pause there. Any thoughts or questions? Because we're going to go into what trauma-informed supervision is and what it's not, and some direct communication strategies for our remaining half an hour. But I want to pause there following that slide on bias, just to see if anyone has any thoughts or reflections.
Hi, I had to get into a quieter space. So I am, like, as a Black supervisor, a lot of the time, the minute I open up my mouth, it's like I get the fear reaction from people. And so I kind of want, and I know that that has a lot to do with other people's biases, which is something I can't control. The question I'm trying to get at, I'm sorry, I didn't think this out all the way.
That's
But
okay.
just like, I feel like as much as I try to like say things in a nicer way or slow down and be crystal clear, unless it's effusive praise, I don't think it's landing with people the way that it should.
Mhm.
So, I mean, there's an element of my own resilience as a manager to like continue to revisit and like figure out different ways to communicate with folks, provide that feedback. And I also wonder about like ways that we can help improve workplace resilience with our teams.
I think that's such an important question, and I would love to hear what other folks in the room think as well. I think the answer, or an answer, is also kind of within what you said, right? Are we creating spaces for people to share feedback, and are we doing so consistently? Because the first time we ask someone for feedback, or you'll hear me say a lot of times, like, how is this landing? Or am I being clear? Or like, instead of going, do you understand what I'm saying? Because then that's like, I'm asking you about your comprehension. I'm saying, am I being clear? Or how can you help me process through like what I'm saying and how it's landing? Creating consistent opportunities for feedback. Or I'm wondering how you're experiencing these kinds of conversations. And likely the first time you ask that, people are like, it's fine, it's fine. Because we're not used to having an environment where feedback is a normal part of the culture. And so by creating that space on a consistent basis, it gives people, particularly with that rule to revisit, an opportunity to say, okay, I know I'm going to be asked that by Ashley again. And when she asks me that, maybe I'll say, I sometimes feel like I'm always doing something wrong, and opening that door for these conversations to occur. But there is also the part of it too, is that by creating an environment where we can all think about the impact of our behaviors or the potential for bias, it gives people a chance to think about, well, what biases am I coming in this space with too? Right? If someone has a natural bias to you just based on tone because of who you are, responding to that, that's not something that's a collective. And I think that's why empowering that web of influence is so important, because when someone says, you know what, I don't know, I feel like every time Ashley says something to me as hostile, someone else could have the courage to say, that's not my experience. I think her tone might be different than what I'm used to hearing in work environments, but I actually think she's quite receptive to feedback. Now we're getting organizational change as opposed to being like, you have this problem. Yeah, that's a really good question. Any other thoughts in response to that? It's like when I got so excited to Kelsey's consistency, right? When we create that consistent environment, that's when we'll see the change. But that's also work for us to not give up and be discouraged when we put out the opportunity and people don't take it. We have to be just as consistent as the oppression that people experience. All right. Eartha has to go, y'all. Sorry, I know that she's your favorite Leo lion in the room, but all right. Let's take a look at what trauma-informed supervision is and what it's not. So, trauma-informed supervision is not providing therapy. It's not saying, tell me about your trauma. I'm here to, it might be a helpful opportunity to refer someone, but the expectation is not that you're spending your time with folks who are on your team to dive into the depths of their experiences. It's also not lowering standards or eliminating accountability. You've come in late for the last 3 weeks with no context. It's totally fine. Totally okay, right? It's not that. It's not saying, your performance hasn't been great or you've been violating boundaries, but I know that that's because this is really personal for you and that's okay. It's not that. It's not defining staff by their trauma history and saying, oh, well, this is how Ashley's going to continuously show up. And when I'm saying Ashley, I'm using myself as an example in name. I recognize that I'm not the only Ashley in this room, but I like to use myself as an example instead of someone else. But I'm not saying, oh, Ashley's, always procrastinating on this because she's had all these, horrible experiences where she didn't get it perfectly before she's gonna, she's afraid. So that's just who she is. Because we know is that there's healing, there's resilience that comes from experiences, and people are not defined by their trauma history. And the trauma history someone has isn't always inherently associated with a negative outcome, right? Some of us have been through things that have been really traumatic and have really shaped the way that we show up in positive and affirming ways. Trauma-informed supervision is also not the solution to every supervision challenge. And most importantly, it is not for staff who have only for staff who we have an understanding of having had trauma, whatever that means. Again, going back to this basic concept is that we really don't even know. In housing services, assuming that everyone is trauma exposed, you're working with people who have a lot of intersecting social needs, and we don't know how that resonates with people. And so that space of inquisition, that space of recognizing that we don't know, assuming that it affects everyone, regardless of their personal history. And so one of the goals that we have within trauma-informed supervision is to create organizational conditions where trauma-exposed staff can still perform effectively. It's like you don't only provide, if you think about like ergonomic environments, right? You don't only provide ergonomic chairs to people who have disclosed that they've had back problems. You create conditions that prevent harm and support sustainable performance for everyone. So what you are doing is recognizing that supervision happens in a very trauma-saturated or potentially trauma-saturated context. And we adjust our approaches accordingly while maintaining professional standards. Trauma-informed supervision is having core recognition that secondary trauma exposure is expected occupational hazard. I'll be honest with you, sometimes that language can be really jarring, and I would never describe it in that way. But what it is in fact describing is that people are going to be completely inundated, listening to people's stories, creating space, doing the work that makes it so impactful. We're not thinking about it as an if and when, but how much are you being exposed to? Some people might be experiencing people yelling at them or creating an environment that's scary for them. Helping them navigate that demonstrates that we care, and these experiences can change people's neurobiology. So it's not a weakness. It's about creating an environment that makes places safer. Secondary stress and secondary trauma can impact decision making. It's impacting our prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for planning and making decisions and emotion regulation. And when we're under chronic stress, that goes offline. This is a normal way that our brain works. And so we have to acknowledge that. This is why people who are typically really good and detail-oriented might make uncharacteristic errors when they're feeling overwhelmed. That's just what happens. So we're not lowering standards. We're recognizing that people might need additional or different support in order to return to their baseline functioning. It's about safety. It's about safety. Can people bring forward cares that they have without fear or without concern? Bye, Derek. Can people admit when they make mistakes? Can they say, I really feel like I'm struggling, without feeling like they're at risk of losing their jobs? And research consistently shows that psychological safety allows people to perform better. It allows people to innovate more, create more, and it drastically reduces turnover. Trauma responses are normal reactions to abnormal circumstances. We also have to consider cultural and historical trauma shape workplace experiences. So in this one, I didn't really get to go into identity-centered trauma, but people's identities, folks of color, are working in systems that have historically harmed communities or experienced complex layers of trauma. We know that LGBTQ staff in housing may navigate additional safety concerns, and this context does matter. And the dynamics within an organization can absolutely shape or buffer or amplify that. Your supervision can provide a buffer from trauma impacts, or it can amplify them. And that's not to put an unnecessary layer of pressure on us, but at the baseline, it's a wonderful reminder to us is that when we feel activated, to allow ourselves to slow down, to listen, and to validate. So some strategies that we can use to do that is the spirit of trauma-informed supervision, also known as the PACE model. Some of you might have heard the PACE model, the P, if you're familiar with it. Well, are folks familiar with PACE? Okay, I'm seeing some nods. I'm seeing some no's. Okay. So depending on who a trainer was on trauma-informed supervision, you might have heard PACE described differently. Sometimes the P is described as playfulness. So you'll see that lightness, that humor show up if it's described as playfulness. And that might feel counterintuitive to the seriousness of the work that you all are doing. But it's more so about maintaining the humanity. Right. And playfulness isn't making a joke about it, but it's maybe, all right, well, let's get creative here. What do we want to do? Let's figure this out together. Allowing for that space of creativity and problem solving, which also goes from a directive of, well, you're bringing me this problem, you need to do this, and giving people directives, but instead creating a partnership that encourages people to think, to say, we're going to figure this out together. I will give you some detailed suggestions for sure, or these are important things that we have to consider. This is what we're required to do. I'm wondering your perspective, but it's inviting people in constantly for that creativity and problem solving. We described and defined compassion fatigue earlier. This is something that will help to combat that, because people able to think about and create solutions will help to reduce those experiences of burnout. Acceptance. Acceptance is absolutely important. Acceptance is seeing people's strengths along with their struggles, being non-judgmental and being curious. That doesn't mean accepting performance that is not conducive to the environment, but it is saying, I can see you're deeply committed to the work that you're doing right now, and I can see that you care. And I know how your documentation is lacking. Maybe we can find a way that we can support you in that, so that doesn't get in the way of the great services that you're providing, that acceptance. Then we have C for compassion, or sometimes people will describe it as curiosity. This is maybe one of the most transformative elements of it. Instead of assuming you know why something happened, you ask about what happened. It's not what's wrong with you. It's what happened. I noticed that something is going on. I want to create space for it. This often reveals very important information that you can then use as a supervisor to take things to the next level. And then the E is usually evocation or empathy, understanding that a lot of the work is an emotional experiencing. Validate without rescuing. You all went through it in my training, which means that I know that you're familiar with ruling with resistance or challenging that writing reflex, right? That natural desire we have as supervisors to fix things. We want to be able to have an empathetic approach that evokes solutions from people. And empathy is not about fixing things or taking away, but just validating the emotional reality of how things can be hard. It balances accountability with compassion. It creates space for people to learn from mistakes. Yeah, we actually didn't get to handle that one perfectly this time, but that means that we have some opportunity to strategize for next time. And it models the approach that we want folks to take with the folks who they're serving. Because the folks we're serving also aren't going to get it right every time, and neither are we. Just to bring to our awareness, we also have these 4 R's of trauma-informed approach, which is to realize the widespread impact of trauma and different paths to recovery, to recognize the different signs and symptoms of trauma in staff as well as in clients. That's typically where we get really good, and maybe we'll be really good at responding by integrating trauma-informed practices, policies, and procedures. But this resist re-traumatization is about taking the information we're able to gather and then utilizing that to create a different outcome, to plan ahead and to create more optimal solutions. So talk about what you all do. And I say what you all do is because I would bet, I'm not a betting person, but if I were, I would bet that you all are doing many of these things. And so may this be a refresher or a reminder, affirmation that some of what you're doing is excellent and to continue to. And if you see things on this list that you're not doing, maybe an opportunity to incorporate some of it. Creating predictability. So after trauma, the brain craves that predictability because it's trying to identify and detect threats. And your supervision, that means holding consistent schedules, making sure that the times that we say that we're going to meet with people, we're available and able to meet with them. We're going to start them, we're going to end them on time, and we're going to be clear about expectations when things change, and continuously create that opportunity for that follow-up, for the feedback and the support. You're also likely validating people's emotional responses, naming that this work is hard, and normalizing reactions. Before we talk about this incident, for example, you could say, I wrote an example. Before we talk about this incident, I want to acknowledge that witnessing that was very traumatic. And I can sense that maybe it was a little bit disruptive or it might be showing up for you. I want to create some space to talk about that before we get into this documentation procedural process, right? Validating emotions. Support boundaries. We want to model that, which means that you also have to be doing that and reinforce healthy professional limits. One of the biggest challenges that's specific to housing is the pull to overfunction. Trauma-informed supervisors support staff in maintaining boundaries and models them. Provide context for organizational decisions, reduce ambiguity and assumptions. When people have to try to figure out why things are happening, why staff changes are happening, why is our meeting time suddenly popping up, that context can really help to alleviate people's anxiousness. And even if people disagree, expressing the why and leaning into transparency culture can be really impactful to help create a trauma-informed environment. Offer choices whenever that is possible. Nothing is too small. It's important for people's agency. We need to address the solution. Do you want to start with what happened, or would you like me to start with what we kind of observed? Even asking people about how they want to talk about the topic that needs to be addressed in supervision provides that sense of agency. So maybe you do have to have a difficult conversation. It doesn't have to start with, we need to get right to what happened. No, it could be providing people some context into how this conversation is going to feel optimal to them. Notice and name strengths, specific recognition of people's competencies, asking how people are doing and meaning it. How you doing? I'm good, thank you. Okay, good. I can tell what specifically has been going well. Right. And of course, we have resources. We talked about how trauma-informed supervision is not being a therapist or a clinical provider for your staff, but it is about, saying, yeah, I know that what you went through was really tough. Here are some other options. Do you feel like you have some colleagues that you can talk about this with? And that person might be you. Right? We don't require people to disclose personal trauma. We don't excuse performance issues because that can also make someone feel unsafe. We don't overfunction or rescue people. We don't use punitive approaches. Unpredictable or chaotic supervision environments can be really hard for people to navigate, and sometimes that's due to our busy schedules. I definitely am guilty of that. One of the things that we want to make sure that we're reducing is not looking for signs, violating confidentiality, and making assumptions. I'm going to go through one more communication strategy. Oh, yeah, does someone
Actually, I have a question. You mentioned that excusing performance issues could make someone feel unsafe. Can you give an example of that?
Absolutely. So let's say that I know I have awareness that I have continuously put in my case notes. And I come to you and I'm like, hey, I have a lot going on. And I recognize that my case notes have been going on. You go, oh, it's totally fine. Right. And I'm like, but my job handbook says that it's not fine. Right. And I'm having this. And then we're talking about staff changes. And I know that there might be instability. And I'm like, well, I'm the only person who I think is really behind on their notes. That means that I am probably the first to go because I'm so behind. And you're constantly telling me that everything's okay, but I'm not sure why it's okay because I know that this is an important part of the role versus to say, yeah, I do see that you're behind. I'm wondering if there's anything that's going on that we might be able to support you around so that we can make sure we can get them in. In fact, we're going to try to get them in by this time so that, they can be able to, we can have this information in case of an emergency, but more importantly, I want to see if there's something that's coming up that's making it especially difficult for you right now, so that I have an opportunity to share that context, but also come up with a plan to right size this thing that I'm aware of that is an actual issue. And I have an opportunity to be accountable as opposed to just letting the issue continue to go on to a point where I just feel like I can't do this anymore. They keep saying it's okay, but now I'm swimming in outdated notes and like, I don't feel like I can do this anymore. And you saying it's okay doesn't make me necessarily feel like I have the support to right size it. Yeah,
Thank
that's a
you.
good question. Some folks may have heard of Elicit-Provide-Elicit as like a sandwich model. We want to ask people what they know or what they've tried. What's your sense of what's happening here? What have you already tried? Then we want to provide perspective, inform, fill in the gaps, share observations, allow people. I would say this is a great place to say, like, it's okay to disagree, but I'm going to share this context. And then eliciting again, which means checking, understanding, and inviting a response. I want to know, how does that land with you? What questions do you have? Like my favorite that you've seen me kind of do a couple times. I don't know. I just want to make sure I'm being clear in how I describe that. I want to check for clarity on my ability to share that information. Or what might you try from this? Or what feels like it's doable for you? This works because it honors people's expertise and allows people to try things that they have a higher level of buy-in with, increases the likelihood that they'll do it, but also creates dialogue for maybe even us to learn about different approaches that we might not have considered before. Some final communication approaches could also be mirroring back. You all talked a lot about active listening, so I know this is one that you all do a lot or have seen modeled a lot. Sounds like you're feeling overwhelmed by the number of crisis situations. That makes sense to me. Normalizing, name the response. Many staff feel this way. It's really hard navigating or managing an eviction. Being transparent, making your thinking visible. All right, I'm thinking this, right? So that folks know that you're processing live too. You're being asked to have a solution you might not know, as we talked about earlier. So that transparency component of it is really helpful too. And then acknowledging when supervision goes off track. I had to have a conversation today with someone who I supervise. I said, I recognize that because of all the stress and everything that's been going on, I have not really made time for us to check in. I rushed through our last conversation and I don't think it was really helpful. Do you have time to just connect today? But letting them know, like, because I was pretty chaotic in our previous supervision, now I'm putting another hour on your calendar. Trauma Informed says, let me tell you why. I want to let you know that I really feel like I rushed through our last conversation. I want to bring back an opportunity to hear more what you had to share, because I didn't really create space for that last time. That is building trust. And it can be really hard to do as a supervisor. Some indicators that people, and you'll have these slides too. Some indicators is recognizing changes, whether that's personal, professional. People are saying they're helpless, feeling overwhelmed. I just can't do this anymore. You might notice people might disclose to you that they're connecting back to coping mechanisms that they've identified as not helpful for themselves if they choose to disclose that to you. You might notice notable changes in their behavior. We want to express concerns directly and compassionately. Want to connect people to resources and recognize that that might not be our role. Supervision supports professional functioning, but therapy addresses any clinical needs that they have. So we're not trying to be someone's provider. We want to validate people and say, I see you've been dealing with a lot. Is there something I can do to support? My staff often will say, I just go to Ashley when I'm going through things and get my therapy. And I'll joke and laugh and I'll say, well, I'm always here to listen to you, and we'll definitely think about best ways that we can support your wellness and also make sure that you feel good about the work that you're doing. But certainly, if you feel like you want to be connected to services, I'm here to support you with that. Making it very clear that even though I am a mental health provider, I'm not their mental health provider, and that keeping that area and space, making sure that they're safe within that dynamic. And I really wish we had more time, because the rushing through of this slide is not indicative of the importance of it. This is really, really important. Recognizing self-care for supervisors as the key ingredient. The thing about trauma-informed supervision is it does help to create this healthier environment, this healing-centered environment, improve productivity, but it also has benefits for us too. It makes it so that we don't have to know everything. It allows us to recognize that sometimes the actions of the people who we have the opportunity to supervise can cause us anxiousness, right? We also have to create space for the folks who are agencies or our work, our organizations might serve. But we're also getting that not only from the people directly, but from the people who we are supervising and from the organizational level and all the policies that are influencing it. And so this experience of secondary and vicarious stress is really pertinent for us to think about how it impacts us. You're hearing about the stories from the people they're serving and from themselves. Organizational stress that shows up with competing demands. Having some level of responsibility for shifting those outcomes and creating a culture of change. And you might be navigating some systems. I like to be fully transparent that may not support trauma-informed approaches. You still need this data, and you need it to be put in this particular format. And so sustainable supervision requires that you have your own places of support if that's what you choose to do. And it might not be clinical. I want to push back against this. While this is some of the best practices in the field, I also recognize that it doesn't have to be finding clinical supports. And I want to talk a little bit about the importance of self-care and redefining self-care for us. Clear boundaries around availability. Regular self-assessment with compassion fatigue, personal trauma. I think my favorite thing to talk about when I'm engaging in a conversation about self-care is that term is really activating for people. And the activating component of it that I think is most pervasive is that it suggests that there's one way to do it, or that there's a right way to do it, or that it requires some external spots. You have to go see a professional. You have to go on a trip. You have to keep up with your basic hygiene. But when we think about what is self-care, it's something that is caring for, meaning it's improving the outcomes. And that could look a multitude of different ways. It could be, spending time with your family and loved ones. It could be dancing in the rain. It could be, hiding ice cream snacks from your children in vegetable containers in the freezer. Whatever that looks like, that's for you to define. And we have to move away from this notion that there is a right way to do this. Because of time, I'm going to close out on a slide that kind of gives us a diagnostic tool, but I will send these practice steps from awareness to action, things that we could do this week, things that we can do this month, and things that we can do this year, just so that you can have some next steps. And I'll end on this slide really quickly because I know we're at time at this moment. I started this off by saying that I'm not a good cook, and that is true. And therefore, I always find this slide on ingredients for change to be quite amusing for myself. What we know is that if you don't have the right ingredients for a cake, it's not going to come out right. We also know that we need the right ingredients to be able to create a change in environment. And so it's important that people have the vision of what we're trying to do. They feel like they have the skills to do it. People are incentivized and motivated, that we're creating an environment that has the resources, including time, to process how to put this into action. And then action plans with those next steps. Because when we don't know the full vision of the why we're doing this, people can be confused. And when we don't know how to do it, we don't feel like we have those skills, people can be really anxious. When we're not incentivized to do it, you'll see slow, gradual changes. And by 2035, we will have a healing center organization. It's a little bit more urgent than that. And when we don't have the resources to do it, we feel very frustrated. And we don't have an action plan, we'll just keep trying things, and then people will have fatigue from change that isn't sustainable. And so we want to make sure that we have all of these necessary ingredients for change, because when we do, we can have a higher level of trust and confidence that that change will be possible. Rule to revisit. I'll share my email with you all in case you want to follow up or ask questions. It has been an absolute pleasure to spend this time with you all. We got through a lot of content in a very short amount of time. So please take me up on the opportunity to connect if you do have any questions or want to follow up. Thank you all so much.